All right, we're here with Quentin Palfrey, who, hey, this is the first time we've had someone for the new podcast here in my basement. That's fantastic. This is grassroots politics at its best right here. So Quentin, it's great to have you, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's nice to be back in Pittsfield.
It's great to have you here. Great energy, and the last time we spoke, it was 4 years ago. And we were talking before the show how it's kind of like a situation where feels like yesterday in a lot of ways. And it's like almost time has stood still in a lot of ways. But then, of course, everything has changed since then through the pandemic and the rest. But you were running for lieutenant governor back then. And I look at your background and your resume, and I almost think, you know what, attorney general almost seems like a better fit for you. A big law background, certainly that's been a core of you, Harvard Law, and many other positions and work in the law. So running for attorney general, tell me about this run for you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be running for attorney general. I was a assistant attorney general in the office and was able to see firsthand how much impact the AG office can have on people's lives across the state. I was the chief of the healthcare division at the time that we were implementing Massachusetts health reform law. So we worked really hard during that time to make sure that everyone had access to high quality, affordable healthcare. We stood up for consumers and workers during that conversation. We're very concerned about racial disparities. I also brought some consumer protection lawsuits against some insurance companies that were taking advantage of Massachusetts residents all across the Commonwealth during that really critical time. So they were offering health insurance products that didn't really cover the kinds of risks that people face. And so they were excluding really important things from coverage and also lying to consumers across the states. You imagine you sign up for what you think is just a low cost insurance plan, and then you find out that you're not actually insured against risk when you have cancer or something like that, and then it devastates your family. And that's a good example of one of the ways that the AG office can really be effective for people across the state. So I really enjoyed working in the office, seeing how much impact that it could have. And then I've also had the opportunity to see the other end of the spectrum. I was in the White House under President Obama. I was senior advisor for jobs and competitiveness and really worked on some of the economic challenges that we were facing in the wake of the Great Recession. So as we were sort of clawing our way out of that really big economic catastrophe, we wanted to rebuild the economy in a way that worked for everybody, that really sort of broadened our economic prosperity. I think that we've seen over the course of the last few decades, the rich really getting richer and the very rich getting a lot richer, and everybody else really struggling to make ends meet. And so we were focused on that economic policy. And then when President Biden was elected, I was asked on day one to come into the Commerce Department, where I was acting general counsel of the Commerce Department. And so I led a team of several hundred lawyers as we were sort of taking over the government from President Trump. And so simultaneously, we were trying to clean up some of the mess that we'd inherited. So for example, all of the legal issues of the census were my problem on day one. But at the same time—
That must have been fun.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think that, when I think about the Trump administration, there's a certain amount of cruelty to it, where they were trying to rip apart families, put walls between us and our neighbors. They're really an attack on our democracy. There's also a lot of corruption and a lot of mismanagement. And I was involved both in the transition from Bush to Obama and from Trump to Biden. And what we inherited from the Trump administration was really shameful in a lot of ways. And so the work of trying to rebuild faith in our government, get our economy going again, the Build Back Better agenda, I think, has a lot in it that will help people all across the state, but certainly out here in Berkshire County and in Pittsfield. I think that, a lot of the infrastructure work is going to make a really big difference. There's a lot of need out here for access to technology, to Wi-Fi, to broadband. There's a lot of need for transportation investments and education investments and getting jobs going. So I think there's a lot to be said for the agenda that we launched out of the Biden administration. But at the same time, I think that Washington's broken at a fundamental level. And it's hard to think that the solutions to really big challenges that people face are going to come out of Washington.
And I think it's one thing that you brought up, and I think it's a general theme in this nation now and really around the world, is the sort of corporate powers that have become, they've always been very, very powerful. Now with Citizens United and all the policy that has followed, I think from there, in a lot of ways over time, it seems to me that it is the role of the attorney generals, and not just in Massachusetts, but the attorneys general across the country, that they have that opportunity to be able to find the wrongdoing, whether it's pharmaceutical companies, whether it's health insurance companies, and I think for regular people, the political side of things, okay, Republican, Democrat, in a lot of ways, there's a dynamic of the corporatization against the people in a lot of ways. And I think the attorney general position is one that has some power to be able to address this, and that's where you see some of these more high profile cases, a lot of them coming out of New York State. Of course, Maura Healey has had her share, where it's been very high profile. And so what is the AG's role in regard to that? I mean, you mentioned it with the health insurance companies, but protecting the people against the corporations often that are wronging them.
Yeah, I think that there's a really important role for the attorney general to stand up for working people, to stand up for consumers, to stand up for civil rights. One of the things I really enjoyed about working there as an assistant attorney general was feeling like every day you were actually interacting with consumers who had specific complaints, and we had hotlines, we had mediation programs, we brought cases on behalf of workers and consumers, and so you could really tangibly touch people's lives and stand up for people against unfair and deceptive trade practices and violations of civil rights. And at the same time, I think, as you're saying, the attorneys general across the country have played a really important structural role, particularly when they band together in these multi-state cases. They can sort of punch above their weight. And I think over the last couple of decades, the AGs have sort of learned how to use that power to make a big dent on really important issues, taking on big banks, taking on insurance companies, taking on pharmaceutical companies when they are harming consumers. And it used to be that I think AGs were reluctant to take on really big defendants, partially because only a portion of the harm was in their state, and partially because when you brought a consumer protection case against a big bank, for example, there were a huge number of lawyers on the other side. They could afford to really fight out the litigation in a way that would make it very hard for a single attorney general to have a credible threat of litigation. When the AGs started to work together in these multi-state actions, that script flipped a little bit. And you could then go forward and say, look, you're not just taking on Massachusetts, you're taking on Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, California, and a whole bunch of like-minded states. And then all of a sudden, when we threaten to sue, they stand up and they take notice. And Massachusetts has played a really big part in those multi-state actions, not just against the Trump administration. I think Maura did a really effective job of using the office as a tool for fighting back against an immoral and corrupt Trump administration, but also knowing when it's important to take on a big challenge, like, say, the Sacklers in the opioid crisis. I was one of the lead attorneys in a large insurance bid rigging and price fixing case that Massachusetts was one of the lead offices on, that led to a $175 million settlement with a large insurance company back in the mid, sort of the 2006 kind of a range, 2005. So I think we've seen that is a role that the AG can play. And I think it's a balance, right? There are times when we want to take on the really big cases and make sure that we're standing up for those really big issues. But I also think it's really important for us to focus here on Massachusetts, to focus on consumer protection, workers' rights, civil rights, and make sure that we're devoting our resources to Massachusetts problems.
And I think, I mean, we see that quite a bit because, I mean, these corporations are so powerful when the little guys and literally citizens are attempting to try to make some change. It's almost impossible because, I mean, for instance, we have a cell tower that Verizon put up in a neighborhood in Pittsfield where it's impacting people, and they're trying to fight it. It's so hard because they have an army of attorneys, of course, and generally an FCC that is basically with them in policy. So, in that case, those are places where if there's merit, maybe the attorney general, can step in cases like that.
I think that's absolutely right. And I liked the phrase that Maura Healey has used for the office, the notion of the people's lawyer. And I think that we've sort of shifted the focus of what an AG office is and should be from something I think people think a lot about it as the chief law enforcement officer and the sort of law and order approach. And I think that shifting the focus to the notion that this is really about standing up for consumers and making sure that everybody gets a fair share in this economy. And I think that's a good example of one of the things that we can do. We can also stand up on really big issues like climate change. I think that this is one of the things that's going to determine what kind of a life our grandchildren or great-grandchildren live. And I think that we've seen how difficult it's going to be to make progress at the international level and even at the national level. You see Mitch McConnell, for example, and Joe Manchin blocking a lot of the sensible things that you'd like to see happen at a national level. I think if you think about who's going to solve those problems, it's going to come from regional collaboration. It's going to come from state action. And I think all of us who are in public service need to be thinking about how can we bring urgency to the fight against the climate crisis. So if you think about the AG office has a lot of opportunities there for fighting against the climate crisis. There's the obvious ones, like the AG is someone who can sue polluters. And there are times when the AG office has done that really effectively and has also pushed back against the federal government when they've been disregarding environmental protections. But there's also a lot of opportunities in clean energy. There are a lot of opportunities in overseeing utilities. There are a lot of opportunities to think about racial justice as it relates to environmental protection. So we've seen that communities of color are more likely to bear the brunt of climate change. And so racial justice in the environmental context is a really important thing for us to be thinking about from a civil rights perspective. And then if you're representing agencies, you need to think about the climate impact of those agencies' actions, where you're representing them, you're defending them, you want to make sure that the Commonwealth has good representation, but we want to make sure that over the long term, what's going to be in the best interest of everyone in the Commonwealth is if we have climate as a priority. And so we need to be counseling our agencies that they need to make that a priority as well.
And it's so funny because I was just briefly before you came into the podcast, a friend asked me, so what is he running for? Attorney General. And I described it as, well, it's sort of like the district attorney, except for all of Massachusetts, but it's not really that. And so, how would you describe that position as it relates? Because a lot of people know, okay, the DA is the chief prosecutor, that sort of thing in a county, but the attorney general, like you said, it has this sort of broader role, and it's not just that. You know what I'm saying? So how would you describe that?
Yeah, one
that
of the exciting things about the Attorney General's office is that it does touch on so many different aspects of people's lives, whether that's questions of racial justice, questions of the climate crisis, consumer protection, standing up for reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, workers' rights, student loan debt, gun violence. We have an opportunity to use that office to do a number of things that I think we all want some progress on. And so I think that moving away from the notion of this as the Commonwealth's chief law enforcement officer, which to some extent it is, and certainly the chief lawyer for the Commonwealth, and moving towards the notion that this is really about being the people's lawyer, about being a consumer advocate and a workers advocate. There are opportunities to be involved in the conversation around criminal justice reform. I think that this is a time where we need to be rethinking what criminal justice means. The murder of George Floyd and the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict, they're just the most recent reminders that there are two justice systems in America. We imprison too many people for too long for doing too little. Race has too much to do with who ends up in the criminal justice system. So we do need to take on that set of challenges with some urgency. And I think that the Attorney General can play a really big role in using the bully pulpit to start pushing in the direction of sensible reforms to criminal justice, to prisoners' rights, to policing issues. So I think that we need to be a major player in the conversation around criminal justice reform. But it is not primarily what the AG office does. A lot of the things that people think of as the key kind of role of prosecutors are done by district attorneys. So district attorneys tend to be the ones who do the prosecutions of murders and rapes and burglaries and drug offenses and those sorts of things. The AG does have criminal powers and needs to use them in some contexts, but we are also one of the places where we can kind of set the agenda for that conversation. It's been a really exciting conversation over the last couple of years to see progressive prosecutors like Rachel Rollins, for example, who is the Suffolk County District Attorney, is now the U.S. Attorney. She's looked at being innovative about how to think about the discretion that prosecutors have in order to try to rebalance a system that has led to enormous racial disparities. And I think overall, we as a country are incarcerating too many people. So if you look at the United States relative to some other affluent democracies, we incarcerate a much higher percentage of our population. There's a huge racial disparity there, but there also is just generally an over-incarceration problem. I think that we want to shift our focus away from sort of punitive measures to trying to get at some of the underlying structural challenges. So more emphasis on substance use treatment. I know the opioid crisis has hit the Berkshires very, very hard, as it has the entire state. We need to be investing in the services and the treatment for people with substance use disorder. We need to be investing in mental health services. We need to be thinking about how to make sure that people have stable housing, stable jobs, those sorts of things. We need to keep the community safe, of course, and we need to prosecute crimes when people have violated the law. But we need to rethink the way that we have sort of used the criminal justice system as a blunt object to deal with some problems that may not be primarily about law and order or about public safety.
And talking to voters, when you look at it, it's interesting because voters kind of appreciate some of the legal issues, certainly the incarceration issues, but a lot of times when you have conversations, it leads back to what is affecting their life directly, and so that's why, the AG position, of course, is a little bit different than, say, a mayor or a governor or that sort of thing, or even a city councilor, clearly. However, I'm sure you're hearing it, and because people are concerned, they go to the grocery store and they're spending a lot more on groceries, and it's tough to make ends meet right now with an inflation. And also, are we ever going to get back to normal? Are my kids going to be wearing masks in school? Are we going to be able to move away from that finally? That sort of thing. So what are you hearing, from people? I feel like people are kind of like frustrated. They're kind of like over it. Can we please just get back to normal, maybe like, let's get rid of some of this inflation? So, how does that impact you in your race, where those issues are not necessarily first and foremost on what the AG does, but you got to be hearing it?
I think there are definitely things that the AG does and should. One of the things I really enjoy about campaigning in a grassroots sense, is that you go out to communities, and we've traveled to to all 40 state Senate districts, and at least recently by Zoom. You hear about the challenges that people are facing. The AG office also has lots of opportunities to hear from folks through hotlines, and to sort of calibrate the caseload on the basis of what people come to the office with as concerns. And you do see some trends there in terms of things that people can get help from the AG office on. So for instance, student loan debt is a major driver of of consumer protection problems in the Commonwealth. You see a lot of families delaying buying a house, and you also see senior citizens still carrying student loan debt from 20 or 30 years ago. And the AG can play a really aggressive role in taking on predatory lenders and fighting for consumers when they're being mistreated in some of those arrangements. And I also think that we can stand up for student loan forgiveness. I'm a proud alum of the Biden administration, but I'd love to see much more aggressiveness out of Biden in terms of forgiving student loan debt. And so I think the AG can play a really big role there. I think the AG can play a really big role with housing issues. So I hear a lot that people have trouble making ends meet, either as a renter or as paying a mortgage. And the AG has a lot of tools for protecting consumers when they're dealing with banks in the mortgage context. Certainly, right as we came out of the Great Recession, there was a very active predatory lending focus within the office, both sort of on the civil rights side, looking at some of the ways that there are disparate impacts in the lending space, and also just in terms of the unfair and deceptive trade practices enforcement. We can stand up for consumers, for borrowers, and for renters, and help in some of those lending contexts. And we can help workers. So one of the things that we're hearing about a lot is wage theft, and some of the ways that contractors hire subcontractors who then misclassify workers, don't pay overtime, don't pay benefits, don't treat them as employees. The AG has some powers to enforce existing fair labor laws, and does so aggressively. But I think there's a lot more that we can do on wage theft. And we also can call on the legislature to expand the powers of the AG office to stand up for workers. So there's a piece of legislation that's pending on Beacon Hill that I'd really like to see taken up, that would give the AG greater power and give workers greater power when they're being mistreated in the employment context.
And of course, that's another issue where it's kind of like divide and conquer, because what you have is, we know Amazon and Wayfair and Walmart, they can surely afford to pay at least $15 an hour. In fact, I think $15 an hour is low now, especially with the inflation. The wages have just not kept up at all in our country, as the costs have continued to rise, where people are now compared to where they were in 1970. We all know, that that's a huge dichotomy of where wages should be for the overall populace. But then you have this situation where you have the small business owners who are like, well, we're just making ends meet ourselves and so forth. So that issue always, that's the same dynamic every time. The small business owners, like, you're going to crush us. You're going to crush us. Yeah, but if you give more money in the pockets to the people who are out there working for the Walmarts and the Home Depots, they'll be able to spend more money, So it's just one of those things that it's like the divide and conquer thing. So, and then it's difficult, although we've made progress on the wages. But that's more of a commentary, less of a question.
I think you're entirely right. And one of the things I'm very enthusiastic about is the Fair Share Amendment, because I think that one of the solutions to the challenge that you're mentioning is that we really do need the very wealthiest people in this society to pay a little bit more, so that we can invest in broad-based economic growth. So what we've seen over the last couple of decades is the top 1% getting a lot richer, and the top 0.1% getting a lot richer. And we do need to recalibrate that. The Fair Share Amendment, the idea is that we should have the very wealthy pay a little bit more. We should take that money and invest in the things that are going to allow us to have a broad-based growth. So basically, let's invest that in transportation. Let's invest that in education. And let's make sure that when you grow up in Pittsfield, you have economic opportunities. You have great schools that have the resources to prepare you for the economy, but also that we have a transportation system that works, and that we sort of build an infrastructure around Wi-Fi and broadband and other sorts of things, so that everybody can prosper in this economy. And then those folks will go to the small businesses, and those small businesses will thrive as well.
And basically, fair share is basically just a modified graduated income tax. It's nothing that dramatic. If it has, unless it's changed, it was those who earn $1 million or more at $1,001, they just pay a higher tax rate, which I believe that is the same as
that's exactly right.
Okay.
And you talked about the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world. We also should be concerned about the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world. And in particular, right now, we see some of these gig economy companies trying to get around the paying workers as employees, and they couldn't get this reform or this change through the legislature. And so what they're trying to do is put a ballot initiative on the Massachusetts ballot, and they're going to pour tens of millions of dollars into advertising in order to try and convince people that misclassifying workers, not giving them the rights that they would have as employees, is somehow going to be good for those workers. And it's a cynical strategy, because what they want to do is have this be the first step in a national strategy that misclassifies workers. And I really think that as the economy is shifting, this is going to be like a key moment, is whether these multi-billion-dollar companies are going to be able to change the worker classification.
For example, if you order something from Amazon, it's an independent person who's dropping it off, and so Amazon doesn't have to have liability. They don't have to pay insurance. They're able to have this independent contractor do it. Sometimes UPS also or USPS will also deliver, but it's a way for a big company to have a service provided to them with very little liability or cost. Those kinds of things. Of course, that would be I think that'd be a good issue for the Attorney General, to focus on as well, because these people, and they're out there doing a service for Amazon. Amazon isn't taking any of the risk in a lot of ways. That's just one example.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. So, I think that the AG should be a workers' champion. And some of that is just implementing the laws and the powers that we have in the Fair Labor Bureau. But some of that is also being an advocate and helping to set the conversation that we really should be protecting workers, that wages should be rising, that benefits should cover people. And, people should be able to, if you work really hard, you should be able to make ends meet. And sometimes in this economy, it doesn't work that way. And we need more people.
There is a basic. If you work a job for 40 hours a week, as the society asks you to do, you should be able to have a place to live. You should be able to buy food to eat, and maybe even support a family. And again, that's how things it used to be way back in the day, long before I was ever working. You could have one person working and support a family of 2 or 3 kids. That's totally impossible now, completely impossible. Certainly in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's right. And, and the healthcare is also a big part of that. I was, as I mentioned, I was the first chief of the healthcare division. And I think healthcare ends up being one of these things that make it really hard for people to make ends meet. I'm a big advocate for Medicare for all, but in any event, we ought to be working to make sure that insurance companies don't take advantage of consumers, that pharmaceutical companies don't overcharge consumers, that they're making fair representations. Insulin shouldn't cost what it costs. We've seen some really bad examples of pharmaceutical companies jacking up prices well beyond what they needed in order to recoup their R&D investments. And we've seen, some extreme examples, but like the Sackler family, where the
Sure.
misrepresentations had really devastating consequences. You think about who's going to stand up for consumers on those issues. And I really think it is the people's lawyer, it really is the AG. And so I think healthcare is one of the places where you need to have a zealous advocate in there and somebody who understands the system. It's a very complicated system. And, those costs are rising and rising and rising. And we need to understand the antitrust laws and some of the ways that concentration of market power, lead to those rising prices. But at the end of the day, you should be able, if you have health insurance, to afford to get sick. And if somebody in your family gets sick, that should not lead you to the brink of bankruptcy. And too often now, if somebody in your family gets sick with COVID or anything else, it has really devastating consequences for families. And so I think the AG can play a really big role in that. And I've been working on that issue for a long time.
Now, I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah.
You come in, we of course talk a lot of about the issues and politics and the rest, but you're from Massachusetts.
So I grew up
originally.
in Worcester County. My parents were pediatricians. So my dad was working at St. Vincent's Hospital in Worcester, and my mom was working at Children's in Boston. And so they
What's it like being the kid of two pediatricians?
You don't get away with anything. If you complain about a stomach ache, they ask you a bunch of questions, and then they're like, "Nah, go to school."
I'm just gonna go to school. Forget about it.
Yeah, no, that's right. My parents were
not
definitely in the no whiners school of medicine. We didn't get away with anything, but no, it was great. And I grew up seeing them. They were very interested in public health issues. My mom worked with a lot of kids who had special needs and making sure that they were getting the services that they need. My dad has worked a lot on kids experiencing poverty, on lead poisoning, on immunization, so they were very interested in some of the social aspects and some of the anti-poverty aspects of that. And so anti-poverty work has been a big part of what I've done throughout my career. I was a legal aid lawyer when I was at Harvard Law School. I ran a nonprofit that focused on child protection in the Philippines with some of the world's poorest children.
Mm-hmm.
I founded an organization at Harvard that focuses on some of the access to medicines issues that some of the world's populations face. I ran something called the Poverty Lab at MIT, JPAL North America, that uses evidence-based policy to fight poverty. So this issue of poverty and inequality has really kind of run through my career. I've been a lawyer for about 20 years. I was in the AG office. I was in the Obama administration and in the Biden administration. And then I've run a series of nonprofits. So I founded a nonprofit organization focused on voting rights called the Voter Protection Corps. Been very interested for a number of years in the kinds of challenges to our democracy that we're seeing today, voter suppression, and some of the obstacles that voters face when they're trying to register and vote and have their votes count. So I've been very interested in that set of issues. And I've also been very interested in some of the consumer protection issues in the digital economy. So consumer protection looks a lot different in 21st century economy with large tech companies than it did 20 or 25 years ago. And we do need our thinking on consumer protection to include those kinds of digital challenges, privacy and cybersecurity, disinformation online, that kind of thing. So that was some of the work that I was doing in the Commerce Department in the White House. And I've founded and run a consumer protection nonprofit about digital issues over the last couple of years as well.
That must be, you must have learned a great deal during that process, because it just changes. I mean, the information, obviously is instantaneous and there's so many different platforms and so much. And, the questions about misinformation, well, what is misinformation, and who's providing the misinformation? This has been a brave new world in a lot of ways, trying to figure out, what is going on in this world. I think the average person sometimes just doesn't know who to trust nowadays. It's just very difficult.
There's a fair amount of Wild West out there. I mean, I think that, digital transformation, the digital revolution has transformed every aspect of our economy over the last 30 or so years. And with each of those transformations, there are both lots of opportunities and lots of challenges. So if you think about healthcare, there's an enormous possibility that comes with personalized medicine, right? So I use a Fitbit, it monitors my movements, it gives an enormous amount of data that could be used to do chronic disease management, some of the health conditions that are devastating across a number of communities, whether that's obesity or diabetes, mental health challenges, these sorts of things. We can be much more sophisticated in treating those conditions and getting ahead of preventative medicine. There's also now real opportunities for personalized medicine. You can see what they're doing with some of the genetic research and some of the super blood. It's very personalized, and so that data has a ton of transformational potential. At the same time, if you create all of these data and then they're available, and they can be used in ways that are not in your best interest, you have to be concerned about the cybersecurity risk. You got to be concerned about the privacy risk. You got to be concerned about how you allow for greater access to the data, but in a way that is really in favor of the consumers or the patients. The same things happen in education, right? So if you think about how you actually teach kids and how they learn, or adult learners, the more you can know about what you know and you don't know, the more you can target the learning at the individual learner's level. So sometimes you've got a classroom and some of the kids are totally lost and some of the kids are totally bored, and then some of the kids are right there in the middle. That's really inefficient. And one of the things we've learned about education is that the more you can kind of tailor the education to where the individual student is in their learning trajectory, the better, the more effective that can be. So there's lots of transformational possibilities to this sort of personalized learning, but you got to make sure that it's done in a way that actually protects kids, because kids' information online is often misused. And so in every aspect of this, there's sort of a transformational possibility, and there's a challenge that you need to protect. And so you want to figure out how to do the consumer protection issues in a way that still maximizes the benefit for the kids or the patients, but that also keeps them safe and makes sure that that the business models of the companies that are using the data doesn't turn into, your Cambridge Analyticas,
right?
Or some of these data end up in the hands of Russians and Chinese adversaries.
Yeah, I think people generally have been really, up until a certain point, really okay with basically sharing a lot of information, especially if it sort of tailors their experience online and that sort of thing. I think where you start to see people starting to push back, and it makes sense, is when it starts to impact their abilities. Like, for example, whether you're for them or against them, a vaccine mandate would impact someone, whether or not they can go to a grocery store potentially, or a movie theater, or that sort of thing. So I think those are the kinds of things where it's like, okay, well, if I'm just living my life and I can go about my life, okay, then take my data. But if you're using it in order to impede me on my freedom, then that's where you're going to see the pushback naturally.
Yeah, I think we need to have clearer rules. I think that Congress needs to set a baseline. When I was in the Obama administration, we called for something called a Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights that would allow for there to be a baseline of rules that everybody can understand to protect consumers. And that would be better for businesses too, because what ends up happening now is that the rights that you have differ depending on the kind of data, where you are. There's a lot of differences from state to state. And that ends up being really hard for businesses because it's very hard for them to know what the rules are and play by those rules. The people who, or the companies that do the best job of playing by those rules, are at a strategic disadvantage against some of the more unscrupulous players. And so from a business perspective, it's actually really harmful to have a patchwork of rules. But from a consumer perspective, it's really bad, because what ends up happening is you see these, these jargon-filled privacy policies. Everybody just clicks through them. Nobody knows what's on, paragraph 10.
I think someone did a study that if people were to read all that, it would literally take years of their life.
Yeah, and so, but we have
at least weeks anyway,
that people are reading and understanding those things, and that's changing your relationship with the company that is then using your data and selling it to third parties, and then it gets aggregated and used in ways that you can't control, and that's not good for anybody. And so we need some baseline rules. The best thing would be for Congress to do that. Congress is broken. And so we need states to step into that void. And I'd love to see Massachusetts step up and put in place some greater consumer protections for consumers online. The AG office has been a real leader in those kinds of protections. But Massachusetts needs to step up and put in place better rules of the road, so that everybody understands what the rights and responsibilities are, and you're not putting too much weight on those click-throughs. Yes, I agree. I don't know what I just agreed to, but I do agree. That's not a way to be running this. And so, I'd love to see the legislature take that up, but I think that the AG office in the meantime can do a lot to protect people online.
Yeah, I look at that position as like the sort of independent body, and not that it's devoid of politics. Of course, it's party politics on how the attorney general is chosen, for sure. But it's kind of its own entity that has this extra power in a lot of ways. You're able to do things that a governor can't do. The governor can do a lot of things you can't do as an attorney general, of course. But I think this banding together, it's shown that across states, and you can change policy with the power of the attorney general. So I really feel like people don't recognize how important this position. I think, certainly Maura Healey has brought, some more exposure to that, for sure. A little bit more national exposure. But I can tell you that I think, people really need to pay attention to this race and to understand, okay, like, what does Massachusetts want to be on the national scale? When you look at these big issues, economic issues like we talked about. And I know, like you said, I want to stick to Massachusetts, right? It's about the Massachusetts people, but you do have that national platform as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And hopefully we can get a Democratic governor in there, and hand in hand, a Democratic governor and a Democratic AG. I think that there's a lot that we're going to be able to do on these really big issues.
So Quentin Palfrey, what does the campaign look like? What is the plan, the strategy? I don't want you to give away all your secrets, but
no, there's no secret to this. It's about the grassroots. So we want to build a
politics
campaign.
Actually isn't that complicated. Campaigning isn't that complicated. I shouldn't say.
No, that's right.
It's hard, but it's not easy, but certainly it's not complicated.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up in Worcester County, and I think that there's something in common with a lot of the parts of the state that are outside of the greater Boston area, which is that people feel, I think rightly, that the Beacon Hill often doesn't pay attention to the rest of the state. And so one of the things I want to do as a candidate, but also as an attorney general, is make sure that we are building a grassroots campaign all across the state. So it's really important to me to spend some time in Berkshire County. We're out here in Pittsfield today, and in all of the communities across the Commonwealth, to build a statewide campaign to respect and empower and include people. And that's, I think, where you get the energy for the campaign. I was the 2018 Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor, as you mentioned. We had the opportunity in that campaign to really build a grassroots network across the state. And so, quite simply, my plan for campaigning for the AG office is really to to reconnect with those folks, to build up a grassroots network all across the state. Spend a lot of time out here in Berkshire County and in all of the communities across Massachusetts, and give a voice to those folks, and hopefully ask for support from all across the state. And I think that's the way that the best campaigns are run.
And as I mentioned, and we had the conversation with my good friend Paul Mark, who has a massive district and now running for state senate in a massive district geographically. When you're running across the state, you can't knock on all the doors. You just can't do that. So, so what are some of the ways, the actual tactical ways that you are looking to reach more people for me, in their comfort zone is always the best way. It's not easy, but tell me about some of the ways that you're actually meeting with people.
I think that what we've learned about campaigns is that neighbor to neighbor engagement is the best. And so the more that you can talk to individual voters, the more that you can empower supporters in neighborhoods to talk to their neighbors, the better that it works. So right now we are very focused on these caucuses. They're Democrat caucuses happening all across the state. And we're talking to folks in Democratic town committees and in local organizations, and really trying to go community to community. As we move forward, we'll do more house parties. We'll ask supporters to ask their neighbors to come
Love
meet
those.
with us.
We used to call them coffees.
Yeah,
because,
exactly.
They're coffees, but the cool kids are calling them house parties these days, because
Yeah.
maybe not everybody likes coffee, but those are my old mentor of mine, Jimmy Roberto, the former mayor of Pittsfield. He said, well, if there's one thing you could do every single day, and you only had 30 days to do it, do a house party every day, because that reach is very, very powerful. And yeah, you can knock on doors, but like that, there's a certain energy that comes from that atmosphere.
I think that's
really
right.
powerful.
I think that we've all seen campaigns that focus on robocalling and mass emails and TV as the kind of core of the campaign. And we've seen campaigns that actually get out into communities where people feel like the campaign is about more than just the candidate and is a reflection of our kind of shared values. And you want to be the kind of campaign that people get invested in. And I think that what we've seen, I like evidence, I like data. And one of the things that you see in the campaign data is that what actually works is when somebody speaks up for a candidate that they like. And if you hear from somebody in your community, in your family about a candidate, you're much more likely to support that candidate. And so what you want to do, and now we're calling it relational organizing, but basically what you want is for people to get invested in the campaign because they feel like your ideas are valuable ones for dealing, as you say, exactly with the kinds of issues that you care about in your own life. And then you say, look, check out this candidate. And then you get an opportunity to meet their friends and their neighbors. And that's the way you do it. And so, sure, we do some door knocking, and we certainly do a lot of phone calls and texting and emailing of individual voters. We do some social media kinds of things.
Sure.
But the best thing is if you can meet people in their communities. And so we're working really hard to do that.
Well, sounds like a good strategy. And, they love to come up with these names, relational, this, that, and the other thing. It's like, meeting people.
Yeah, exactly. Meeting people and having people talk to people they know, right? That's what actually works. So
it absolutely does. So Quentin Palfrey, a great pleasure. Thank you for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to be back in Pittsfield.
Enjoy Pittsfield, get some lunch downtown and have a great time at the caucus and say hi to everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.